Kang Joon-Hyuk ruled Seoul's underworld with a single command. Men feared him, rivals disappeared at the sound of his name, and no one had ever dared to block his path. Until two tiny girls did. They stood in front of his black car, their small bodies shaking in the cold night air. His security guards stepped forward instantly, hands moving toward their weapons. But Joon-Hyuk raised one gloved hand. Silence fell. One of the twins looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes and whispered the words that shattered the cold armor around his heart. "Please, Daddy." The bad man took Mommy. The most feared man in Korea felt his world stop. Because when he looked into the little girl's eyes, he didn't just see fear. He saw himself. And in that moment, Kang Joon-Hyuk realized something impossible. The family he never knew he had was in danger. Joon-Hyuk's heart, a thing he thought had turned to stone years ago, shattered in a single second. He didn't look at the black van speeding away. He looked at the twins' eyes. They weren't just brown. They were amber-flecked obsidian. Sharp, lethal. A perfect, terrifying mirror of his own. In the underworld, Joon-Hyuk was known for his cold logic. But today, logic was dead. 6 years ago, a mysterious woman named Amara saved his life from a lethal poison in a hotel room that didn't exist on any map. She vanished before the sun came up, leaving behind nothing but the scent of jasmine and a secret that was now standing in front of him in denim jackets. His brother, Do-hyun, thought he had finally found Joon-Hyuk's weakness. He thought kidnapping the only witness to his past betrayal would secure his throne. But as Joon-Hyuk gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white, he realized Do-hyun hadn't found a weakness. He had just given a monster a reason to become a father. This is the story of a man who thought he had no heart, and the two little girls who proved him wrong. Get ready, because the dragon is home, and he's bringing hell with him. But before we hunt down that van, I need to know who is standing with the dragon tonight. Do me a quick favor, drop a comment. We are building a family here, and we stand stronger together. If you haven't joined the inner circle yet, hit that subscribe button and like this video. Your support is the only thing that keeps this chronicle alive. Now, let's begin. The Seoul rain was not merely falling. It was a deluge, a relentless gray curtain that turned the neon-drenched streets into a shimmering, treacherous mirror. Kang Joon-Hyuk sat behind the wheel of his black armored SUV, his hands gripping the leather-wrapped steering wheel with a force that threatened to crack the internal frame. His breath was steady, a sharp contrast to the adrenaline-fueled chaos screaming through his veins. Beside him, Nia and Nora were buckled into the passenger seat, their small faces pressed against the reinforced glass, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a budding, desperate hope. They had whispered the words that had dismantled his reality, and now they were the only compass he had left. The black van, the vessel carrying the only woman who had ever seen the man beneath the monster, was 3 vehicles ahead, weaving through the congested evening traffic with a reckless disregard for the lives around it. Joon-Hyuk watched it with the cold, calculating eye of a predator. He didn't need to check his mirrors. He knew his security detail was struggling to keep pace, hampered by the very traffic he was about to ignore. He didn't need a gun. A gun was a tool for men who feared the distance between themselves and their enemies. Joon-Hyuk wanted no such distance. He wanted to feel the vibration of the reckoning in his own bones. He floored the accelerator. The engine of the SUV roared, a deep, guttural sound that sliced through the rhythmic drumming of the rain. He didn't swerve to avoid the silver sedan in his path. He nudged it aside with a precise, heavy contact that sent the smaller car spinning into the breakdown lane. He was a force of nature now, a black shadow streaking through the gray mist. The van driver noticed him then, a flash of dark metal in the rearview mirror, and panicked. The van swerved, clipping a delivery bike, its tires hydroplaning for a terrifying second before the driver regained control and accelerated toward the Han River Bridge. "Appa, you're going to catch them, right?" Nora's voice was a tiny, fragile thread. Joon-Hyuk didn't look away from the road, but his jaw tightened. The word Appa, father, hit him with more force than the collision he was about to initiate. "Close your eyes," he commanded, his voice a low, tectonic rumble. "Both of you, close them tight and don't open them until I tell you." He watched in the mirror as the twins squeezed their eyes shut, clutching each other's hands. With the children shielded from the visual violence to come, Joon-Hyuk focused his entire being on the rear bumper of the van. He wasn't just chasing a vehicle. He was chasing a ghost from room 309, a woman who had used the scent of jasmine and the wisdom of an ancient continent to pull him back from the brink of death. As they hit the incline of the bridge, the traffic thinned for a heartbeat. It was all the space he needed. Joon-Hyuk pulled alongside the van, the metallic shriek of their side mirrors colliding echoing over the storm. He saw the driver, a man with a jagged scar and eyes filled with the cheap bravado of a low-level mercenary. The man reached for a weapon, but Joon-Hyuk didn't give him the chance to level it. With a violent, controlled jerk of the wheel, Joon-Hyuk performed a pit maneuver, slamming the front quarter panel of his SUV into the van's rear wheel well. The van spun out of control, its tires screaming against the wet asphalt as it performed a chaotic 360-degree turn. It slammed into the heavy steel railing of the bridge, the impact sending a shower of sparks and shattered glass into the air. The van came to a halt, its front end crumpled like discarded paper, steam hissing from the ruptured radiator. Joon-Hyuk stopped his SUV yards away, the engine idling with a menacing hum. He sat for a second, the silence inside the car absolute. He looked at the twins. They were still, their eyes shut tight. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering over Nia's head for a brief moment before he pulled it back. He wasn't ready to be a father yet. He still had to be the dragon one last time. He stepped out into the rain. The water soaked his silk suit instantly, the cold seeping into his skin, but he didn't feel it. He walked toward the van, his silhouette a dark, imposing shape against the flickering streetlights. The driver's side door groaned open, and the mercenary tumbled out, coughing, a handgun clutched in his trembling hand. "Stay back!" the driver wheezed, trying to blink the blood from his eyes. "You have no idea who." Joon-Hyuk didn't stop walking. He didn't speak. He simply existed in the space, his presence so heavy and absolute that the driver's voice died in his throat. The mercenary fired a shot, but his aim was ruined by terror. The bullet whined harmlessly into the river. Before the man could pull the trigger again, Joon-Hyuk was there. He didn't grab the gun. He grabbed the man's wrist, the sound of bones snapping like dry kindling beneath the pressure of his grip. The gun clattered to the ground, lost to the swirling rainwater. Joon-Hyuk hauled the man up by his collar, pinning him against the side of the wrecked van. The mercenary was large, but in Joon-Hyuk's hands, he looked like a broken doll. "Where is she?" Joon-Hyuk whispered. The rain hammered against them, but his voice was perfectly audible, a cold blade pressed against the man's soul. I was just following orders." "Do-hyun," he said. Joon-Hyuk didn't wait for the excuse. He delivered a single crushing blow, not a punch, but a calculated strike with the palm of his hand to the man's solar plexus. It wasn't designed to kill, but to humiliate, to strip away every ounce of breath and dignity the man possessed. The mercenary collapsed, gasping for air that wouldn't come, his face turning a dark, bruised purple as he writhed on the wet pavement. Joon-Hyuk ignored him, his focus shifting to the rear doors of the van. He ripped them open with a strength born of a decade of suppressed rage. Inside, huddled amidst a mess of zip ties and industrial equipment, was Amara. Her hands were bound, a piece of heavy tape across her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that broke Joon-Hyuk's heart in a way the twins' whispers never could. The scent hit him then, jasmine and the sharp, metallic tang of the herbs she had used to save him years ago. It was a scent that had haunted his dreams, a fragrance he had chased through every high-end hotel and darkened alley in the world. He climbed into the van, his movements surprisingly graceful for a man of his size. He reached for her, his hands, the ones that had just broken a man, moving with the gentleness of a summer breeze. He peeled the tape from her lips, his thumb lingering on her jawline for a heartbeat. "Joon-Hyuk?" she whispered, her voice a fragile, disbelieving sob. "I'm here," he said, his voice cracking for the first time in his life. He pulled a small tactical knife from his pocket and sliced through her bindings as if they were nothing more than spiderwebs. He pulled her into his arms, her head resting against his chest, her heart beating a frantic, terrified rhythm against his own. The children. They took the children. She gasped, her hands clutching at his wet suit. They're safe, he murmured, his chin resting on the top of her head. They're in my car. They're the ones who found me, Amara. They saved you. He felt her shudder in his arms, the weight of the years and the secrets finally collapsing. For a long minute, they sat in the back of that wrecked van, surrounded by the ruins of his brother's Turkey, while the Seoul rain sang a song of homecoming. Finally, Joon-Hyuk pulled back, looking at her. She was older, the lines of her face marked by the struggle of raising two children alone in a world that wanted her gone. But she was still the woman from room 309. She was still the only light he had ever known. We have to move, he said, his eyes scanning the bridge. He could hear the distant sirens of his own security teams. But he also knew his brother wouldn't stop with one van. The estate is secure. My father is waiting. The Kang Syndicate has two new heirs, and it's time the world knew their names. He helped her out of the van, shielding her from the rain with his own body. He walked her toward the SUV, where the twins were still waiting, their eyes shut tight as they listened to the storm. As he opened the door, Nia and Nora opened their eyes, and the scream of joy that erupted from them when they saw their mother was a sound that finally, irrevocably, silenced the dragon's solitude. Joon-Hyuk sat in the driver's seat, watching them in the rearview mirror as they huddled together. A family formed in the heat of a poison and the cold of a betrayal. He looked at the bruised, broken mercenary on the ground, a man who would now serve as a living message to his brother. The reckoning had begun. He didn't need a gun. He had the truth, he had the scent of jasmine, and he had the two identical pairs of obsidian eyes that were watching him with an absolute, unwavering faith. He shifted the SUV into gear and pulled away from the wreckage, the lights of the city flickering like stars in the rain. The dragon was no longer walking alone. He was going home, and he was bringing heaven and hell with him. The drive to the Kang estate was conducted in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the interior of the armored SUV. The rain continued to lash against the roof, but inside, the atmosphere had shifted from the frantic energy of the chase to a thick, suffocating tension. Amara sat in the back, her arms wrapped tightly around Nia and Nora, who had refused to let go of her for even a second. In the rearview mirror, Joon-Hyuk watched them. He saw the way Amara's eyes darted toward the window every time a car passed, her body flinching instinctively at every sudden movement. She was safe, but her spirit was still trapped in the back of that black van, haunted by the realization that the man she had spent 6 years hiding from was now the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave. Joon-Hyuk's hands remained steady on the wheel, but his mind was no longer on the road. The scent of the damp earth and the subtle, lingering fragrance of Amara's skin acted as a key, unlocking a vault in his memory that he had spent half a decade trying to bury. As the neon lights of Seoul blurred into streaks of blue and red, the present dissolved, and the cold leather of the driver's seat transformed into the plush, suffocating luxury of the Grand Imperial Hotel. It was 6 years ago, and the air in room 309 had been thick with the smell of expensive tobacco and the metallic tang of blood. Joon-Hyuk had been at the height of his power, a young prince of the underworld negotiating a merger that would have placed the entire shipping industry under the Kang banner. His brother, Do-hyun, had sat across from him, smiling that oily, practiced smile that Joon-Hyuk had once mistaken for brotherly pride. They had toasted to their father's health with a vintage whiskey, but within minutes, the world had begun to tilt. The poison had been surgical. It didn't strike like a hammer. It crept like a frost, starting in his fingertips and moving toward his heart with a numbing, paralyzed chill. He remembered the look on Do-hyun's face, not one of hatred, but of a cold, bureaucratic necessity. His brother had stood up, adjusted his tie, and walked out of the room, leaving Joon-Hyuk to die on the floor of a suite that had been wiped from the hotel's registry. The door had opened 20 minutes later. Joon-Hyuk, his vision tunneling, had expected a clean-up crew with a silencer. Instead, he saw a woman in a hotel uniform, her dark skin luminous under the flickering chandelier. Amara had been doing a final turn-down service, unaware that she was stepping into a crime scene. When she saw him, The great Dragon of Seoul, reduced to a gasping animal on the carpet. She didn't scream. She didn't run. "Don't call anyone," Joon-Hyuk had managed to wheeze, his hand clutching her ankle with a desperate, dying strength. "They'll kill you too." Amara had looked at him, her eyes wide with a wisdom that seemed to stretch back generations. She had seen the blue tint on his lips and the way his veins were standing out like black ink against his skin. She had dropped to her knees, her hands moving over him with a clinical calmness that defied the chaos of the moment. "I know this," she had whispered, her voice a soothing contrast to the fire in his chest. "My father, he taught me the balance of the root. This is the nightshade's kiss. If I call the police, you die before the ambulance arrives." She had dragged him, an inch at a time, toward the kitchenette of the suite. From a hidden pouch in her pocket, a collection of dried leaves and crushed powders she kept for her own ailments, she had begun a frantic alchemy. She boiled water, the steam carrying an earthy, pungent aroma that cut through the hotel's sterile scent. She had brewed a tea that looked like liquid charcoal and smelled of burnt sugar and ancient earth. "Drink," she commanded, propping his head up against her lap. The first sip was like swallowing molten lead. Joon-Hyuk had convulsed, his body rejecting the cure, but Amara held him firm. Her strength was surprising, a silent iron that matched his own. "Stay with me, dragon," she had murmured, her hand stroking his sweat-soaked hair. "The poison wants the cold. We give it the fire." As the herbal tea began to circulate through his system, the numbing chill was replaced by a localized volcanic heat. The fever took him then, a hallucination-filled journey where the walls of the room seemed to bleed and the shadows danced like demons. But through the fog of pain, there was Amara. She was the anchor. She had stripped off his suit jacket, using cold towels to keep his brain from cooking while the tea fought the toxin in his blood. Hours bled into a single, eternal night. In the height of the fever, the distance between them, the Mafia prince and the migrant worker, had simply vanished. They were just two souls in a room that didn't exist, fighting a battle that no one would ever acknowledge. When the fever finally broke, it left behind a raw, electric vulnerability. Joon-Hyuk had opened his eyes to find her leaning over him, her face inches from his, her breathing ragged with exhaustion. The connection hadn't been born of romance. It was born of survival. It was the unintended passion of two people who had looked into the abyss together and refused to blink. In the quiet, blue light of the pre-dawn, they had sought comfort in each other. A desperate, wordless affirmation of life in the face of the death that had almost claimed them. He remembered the way she tasted of jasmine and the bitter dregs of the tea, and the way her skin felt like silk against his scorched palms. But the morning had brought the reality of the dragon's world back with a vengeance. The sound of a distant shootout in the lobby, the cleanup crew finally arriving, had shattered the peace of room 309. Amara had seen the look in his eyes, the monster returning to the surface, and she had known then that he was a man who brought a hurricane in his wake. While Joon-Hyuk had staggered to the window to prepare for the counterattack, she had vanished, taking the secret of his survival and the life they had created in that room with her. A sharp jolt as the SUV hit a pothole snapped Joon-Hyuk back to the present. He blinked, the neon of Seoul returning to focus. He looked in the mirror again. Amara was watching him, her expression a mirror of the one she had worn in that hotel room. Wary, protective, and deeply, painfully aware of the danger he represented. "We're almost there," Joon-Hyuk said, his voice sounding hollow in the quiet car. "Why didn't you look for me?" Amara's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the hum of the engine like a shard of glass. Joon-Hyuk's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. "I did. For 3 years, I burned every contact I had in London and Paris. Do-hyun told me you were dead. He showed me a report. A fire at a migrant hostel. I thought I had lost the only person who knew I was human." Amara looked away, her hand stroking Nia's hair. "He almost found us 3 times. That's why we kept moving. I thought you were the one sending the men, Joon-Hyuk. I thought you wanted to erase the mistake of that night." "You were never a mistake," Joon-Hyuk said, and for a fleeting moment, the Iron Dragon's voice failed him. "You were the only thing that was real." They pulled through the massive iron gates of the Kang estate, the tires crunching on the gravel path. The house sat atop the hill like a fortress, its windows glowing with a deceptive warmth. Guards in black suits stood at attention every 20 yards, their presence a silent testament to the war that was currently simmering beneath the surface of the city. As the car came to a stop, the front doors of the mansion swung open. Standing in the light was Kang Dae-sung, the patriarch. He was an old man now, leaning on a cane of polished ebony, but his eyes were as sharp as the day he had founded the syndicate. He watched as Joon-Hyuk stepped out and opened the rear door. Amara climbed out first, holding the twins' hands. She looked up at the towering facade of the estate, her face pale. She was a woman who had spent 6 years living in small apartments and working double shifts, and now she was standing in the heart of the most powerful criminal empire in Asia. Nia and Nora looked up at their father, then at the old man on the porch. They didn't run. They didn't hide. They stood with a regal, quiet dignity that made the patriarch's eyes widen in shock. He saw the obsidian eyes. He saw the tilt of their chins. He saw the dragon's blood running through their veins, blended with the resilience of the woman beside them. "So," the patriarch rasped, his voice echoing in the courtyard. "The rumors were true. The dragon has kept a treasure hidden in the mountains." Joon-Hyuk walked to Amara's side, his presence a shield. He didn't look at his father. He looked at the horizon, where the first hint of a gray, cold dawn was beginning to break. The reunion was over. The war for the legacy had officially begun. "They aren't a treasure, father," Joon-Hyuk said, his voice flat and final. "They are the family. And if anyone in this syndicate, including Do-hyun, thinks otherwise, I will show them why I am the one who wears the dragon's ring." Amara felt the heat of his presence, the same heat that had saved him in room 309, and she realized that the man she had saved hadn't just returned. He had become something far more dangerous, a man with something to lose. The heavy oak doors of the Kang Estate Library closed with a sound like a gavel, sealing Joon-Hyuk and Amara into a room filled with the scent of old paper and expensive leather. Outside those doors, the twins were being tended to by a staff that moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a clockwork mechanism. But inside, the air was static, charged with the unresolved energy of 6 years of silence. Joon-Hyuk stood by the fireplace, the orange glow of the embers casting long, jagged shadows across his face. He looked at Amara, who remained standing near the center of the room, her silhouette framed by the towering shelves of books she couldn't read and a history she didn't want to belong to. She looked small in the vastness of the room, yet her presence was the only thing that felt solid to him in a world of shifting allegiances. "You're looking at me like I'm a ghost, Joon-Hyuk," Amara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She finally sat in a velvet armchair, but she didn't lean back. She sat on the edge, ready to bolt at the first sign of the storm. "But you're the one who died in room 309. The man I saved. He was a human being in pain. The man standing there now is the dragon. And that is exactly why I ran." Joon-Hyuk turned, his eyes reflecting the fire. "I spent millions looking for you, Amara. I turned the underworld upside down. I thought you were taken by my enemies. I thought you were leverage being used against me." "I wasn't leverage," she snapped, her eyes flashing with a fierce, protective light. "I was a mother. From the moment I realized my body was no longer just mine, I knew I couldn't stay. You call this an empire, Joon-Hyuk. You call this a legacy. But look at it through my eyes. I didn't see a palace. I saw a graveyard in the making. I saw a world where every meal has to be tested for poison and every car ride is a gamble with death. I didn't want my children to be princes of a graveyard." She stood up, pacing the length of the Persian rug, her footsteps silent. "The night I left the hotel, the air was still thick with the smell of the tea I brewed for you. I was walking down the service stairs when the first shots rang out in the lobby. I saw the men your brother sent. They weren't there to talk. They were there to erase everything that had touched you. I realized then that to you I was a savior, but to the rest of your world, I was a loose end, a witness, a liability." Joon-Hyuk stepped toward her, his voice dropping to a low, pained rumble. "I would have protected you. I have an army, Amara. no one would have touched a hair on your head. And that's the trap, she cried, turning to face him. An army? I don't want my children to grow up surrounded by men with guns. I don't want them to think that protection means living behind 6-inch steel doors. I saw the way you looked at that man on the bridge tonight. The coldness. The way you broke him without a second thought. That is the man the world knows. But Nia and Nora? They have your eyes, Joon-Hyuk, but they have my heart. I wanted to keep it that way. She began to describe the flight of the phoenix. The desperate, calculated journey that began the moment she slipped out of the Grand Imperial's back exit. She told him of the month she spent hiding in a basement in Incheon, listening to the news of the syndicate wars, her stomach turning every time a black sedan turned onto her street. She spoke of the night she realized she was pregnant, not with one child, but two. The terror hadn't doubled. It had crystallized into a diamond-hard resolve. I made a deal, she whispered, looking at the floor. The night I left Korea, I didn't just vanish. I found a man. An old contact of your father's who had been cast out years ago. He provided the papers, the passage to London, and the new identity. In exchange, I gave him the only thing I had, the location of the backup ledger Do-hyun had hidden in the hotel safe. I used your brother's own greed to buy my children's freedom. I thought if I gave him what he wanted, he would leave us alone. I thought if I stayed dead to the world, the dragon would eventually stop looking for a ghost. Joon-Hyuk felt a coldness settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the winter air. You dealt with a traitor to save yourself from me. I dealt with a traitor to save my children from a cycle of blood. Amara countered. For 6 years we lived. Truly lived. We lived in a tiny flat above a laundromat in East London. It smelled of detergent and cheap curry, and the heater only worked half the time. But do you know what we didn't have? We didn't have guards. We didn't have shadows. Nia played in the park without a vest on. Nora went to a school where his last name didn't make teachers flinch. They were just Nia and Nora. Not the twin dragons. Not the firstborn. They were free. She walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling grounds of the estate. The security lights swept across the lawn in rhythmic intervals, searching for threats that were already inside the gates. But the phoenix can only fly so far before the ash catches up. A month ago I saw a car, a black sedan just like the ones in Seoul. It sat outside the bakery where I worked for 3 days. Then the phone calls started. No one spoke, just the sound of breathing. I knew then that the deal had expired. Do-hyun didn't just want the ledger anymore. He wanted the throne, and he realized that as long as I existed, I was the only one who could prove he was the one who poisoned you. We weren't a family to him. We were evidence. Joon-Hyuk watched her, the realization sinking in that while he had been fighting to expand his empire, Amara had been fighting a much harder war. A war to remain ordinary. He saw the toll it had taken, the way she carried her shoulders, the way she never sat with her back to a door. She had been a soldier in a war of his making, armed only with her wits and her love. When they took me at the hotel tonight, Amara said, her voice dropping to a whisper, I didn't pray for my life. I prayed that the girls would run. I told them a year ago, if the bad men ever come for mommy, run until you find the man with the dragon on his ring. Tell him room 309 sent you. I never thought they'd actually have to do it. I never thought they'd find you in a crowd of millions. They didn't find me by accident, Joon-Hyuk said, stepping close enough that he could see the amber flecks in her eyes. The same flecks he saw in the mirror every morning. They found me because blood recognizes blood. They found me because even in a city of 10 million people, they knew who their father was. You tried to build them a world without me, Amara, but you couldn't change who they are. They are Kangs. And in this world, being a Kang means you are either the hammer or the anvil. You tried to make them the grass, but they were always meant to be the storm. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, hesitant for the first time in his life. Amara didn't flinch, but she didn't lean in either. She stood her ground, a phoenix who had burned her wings to protect her nest. You rescued us, she said softly, and for that, I will always be in your debt. But don't mistake my presence here for surrender. I am here because it is the only place Do-hyun cannot reach us today. But tomorrow I want my children back. I want the laundromat and the cold flat and the life where no one knows our names. Joon-Hyuk let his hand drop. The orange light of the fire seemed to die down, leaving the room in a cold, gray twilight. The life you had is gone, Amara. The moment Nia whispered in my ear, the laundromat burned down. Do-hyun knows. The board knows. My father knows. You didn't just bring them to me, you brought them to the throne. And the throne does not let go. He walked toward the library door, pausing with his hand on the brass handle. You didn't want them to be princes of a graveyard. I understand that. But the only way to ensure they aren't buried in one is to make sure I am the one holding the shovel. Get some sleep, Amara. Tomorrow the syndicate meets their heirs. And tomorrow, my brother realizes that the ghost he's been hunting is the one who's going to bury him. He stepped out, the click of the lock echoing like a finality. Amara remained by the window, watching the rain wash away the tracks of the cars in the gravel. She had flown as far as she could, but the flight of the phoenix had ended exactly where it began, in the heart of the dragon's fire. She looked at her reflection in the glass, tired, worn, but still unbroken. She wasn't just a hotel maid anymore, and she wasn't just a fugitive. She was the mother of the heirs to the Kang syndicate, and if Joon-Hyuk thought the dragon was the only one who knew how to burn, he had forgotten who it was that had survived the heat of room 309. As she turned to leave the room, her eyes caught a small, black envelope resting on the side table, the one Joon-Hyuk had ignored. She picked it up, her breath catching as she recognized the handwriting. It wasn't Do-hyun's. It was her own father's script, a message from a past she thought she had buried in the red dust of her homeland. The air inside the Kang syndicate's inner sanctum was colder than the rain-slick streets of Seoul. It was a room designed for intimidation, a cavernous hall of polished basalt and floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the city Joon-Hyuk ruled from the shadows. Long, obsidian-top tables were lined with the syndicate's shadow cabinet, men who had spent decades consolidating power through extortion, shipping, and blood. They sat in silence, their faces as expressionless as the stone walls, but their eyes were restless. They had heard the whispers. They knew the dragon had returned from a routine meeting with two small, dark-skinned children in tow. They knew the woman from room 309 was no longer a ghost. Joon-Hyuk stood at the head of the table, his charcoal suit tailored to perfection, though the bandage beneath his sleeve, a souvenir from the bridge, tugged at his skin. He didn't sit. He never sat when he was preparing to bleed the room of its descent. Beside him, tucked into a chair that was far too large for her, sat Amara. She wore a dress of deep emerald silk, a gift from the patriarch, but her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Behind them, standing on either side of the chairman's high-back throne, were Nia and Nora. The twins were a vision of defiance, dressed in miniature black velvet coats, their hair styled in intricate, identical puffs. They didn't look like frightened fugitives. They looked like statues. Nia's gaze was fixed on the man at the far end of the table, Jang Min-suk, a rival leader who had been waiting for a crack in the Kang bloodline for 20 years. Nora, ever the observer, tracked the movement of the guards at the door. They were 5 years old, but they carried the weight of the Iron Dragon in the tilt of their chins. The double doors at the back of the hall creaked open, and Dr. Park, the syndicate's private physician, walked in. He carried a single cream-colored envelope. The sound of his footsteps on the basalt floor was the only noise in the room, a rhythmic ticking clock that seemed to accelerate the heartbeats of everyone present. He approached the head of the table, bowed deeply to Joon-Hyuk, and placed the envelope on the obsidian surface. The results, Chairman, the doctor whispered, his voice trembling, conducted via 3 independent labs. The markers are indisputable. Joon-Hyuk didn't reach for the envelope immediately. He let it sit there, a small paper bomb in the center of a minefield. He let the silence stretch until Jang Min-suk finally cleared his throat, the sound a jagged rasp in the quiet. Chairman, Min-suk began, his tone dripping with a false, oily concern. We all respect your colorful history, but the syndicate is built on tradition, on pure lineage. You bring us children from the streets of London? Children who look nothing like the Kang ancestors? We need more than a piece of paper to accept that the dragon's throne will be handed to outsiders. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees. Amara flinched, but Joon-Hyuk's expression didn't change. He simply picked up the envelope and tore it open with a slow, deliberate precision. He didn't read the technical data. He went straight to the bottom line. 99.99% paternal probability. Kang Joon-Hyuk. He tossed the paper onto the center of the table. It slid across the polished stone, stopping right in front of Min-suk. "Read it," Joon-Hyuk commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "Look at the markers. Look at the alleles. And then, Jang, look at me." Min-suk glanced at the paper, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Science can be bought, Joon-Hyuk. We know your resources. But the board serves the dragon," Joon-Hyuk interrupted, stepping away from the table and walking toward the center of the hall. He moved with a predatory grace, his eyes never leaving Min-suk's. "And the dragon serves the blood. You talk about outsiders? You talk about lineage?" He reached back, his hand finding Nia's shoulder. He moved her forward, into the harsh light of the overhead chandeliers. The little girl didn't stumble. She stood her ground, her obsidian eyes locking onto Min-suk with a terrifying intensity. "Look at her eyes, Jang," Joon-Hyuk whispered. "Tell me you don't see the fire that burned your warehouses in 19. Look at the way she holds her head and tell me she didn't inherit the pride that built this city. They are not outsiders. They are the continuation. They are the evolution of the Kang name." He turned back to the room, his gaze sweeping over the gathered elders, the mercenaries and the spies. 6 years ago, I was poisoned by a man I called brother. I was left to die in a room that didn't exist. I survived because of the woman sitting next to me. And while I was rebuilding this empire, she was raising the future of it in a world where no one could protect her but herself. He walked back to the head of the table and slammed his palms down onto the obsidian. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "These are the heirs," Joon-Hyuk roared, his voice finally breaking into a terrifying, guttural command. "Nia and Nora Kang, they carry my blood, my fire, and my protection. From this moment on, they are the most sacred assets of the syndicate. Their safety is the only metric of your loyalty." He leaned in closer to Min-suk, his face inches from the rivals. "I want to be very clear, Jang, because I know how you think. I know you see weakness where I see legacy. So listen well. If a single hair on their heads is touched, if a single person in this room even looks at them with disrespect, I won't just kill you. I will erase your entire history. I will burn your families, salt your lands, and make sure that the name Jang is never spoken again in this country." Min-suk swallowed hard, the bravado draining from his face, as he realized he wasn't looking at a businessman. He was looking at a father who had finally found something worth burning the world for. "Do we have an understanding?" Joon-Hyuk asked, his voice returning to a low, lethal silk. One by one, the men at the table bowed their heads. "We understand, Chairman," they murmured in a ragged, terrifying chorus. Joon-Hyuk stood tall, his hand resting on Nora's head now. He looked at Amara. She was looking at him with a mixture of awe and fear. She had seen the dragon before, but she had never seen him claim her children with such violent, absolute certainty. She realized then that there was no going back to the laundromat. There was no going back to the quiet life. They were Kang's now, and the world was their battlefield. "Good," Joon-Hyuk said, pulling his children closer to his sides. "Now clear the room. I have a brother to find, and he has a debt that can only be paid in red." As the men scrambled to exit the hall, Joon-Hyuk remained at the head of the table, a silhouette of power and protection. He looked down at the DNA results, the paper that officially turned his mistake into his mission. He knew the fight was only beginning. He knew Do-hyun was already moving in the shadows, and he knew his father, Dae-sung, was watching from the security room, weighing the twins' value against the stability of the throne. But as Nia reached up and gripped his hand, her small fingers curling around his, Joon-Hyuk felt a surge of strength he had never known. He had ruled through fear for a decade. He had commanded armies and moved billions. But as he looked into the eyes of his daughter, he realized that the greatest power he ever possessed wasn't the syndicate. It was the two little girls who had called him Daddy in the rain. He turned to Amara, his expression softening for the briefest of seconds. "They are safe now, Amara. I promise you." "Are they?" she whispered, looking at the empty chairs where the predators had just been sitting. "Or did you just put a target on their backs that the whole world can see?" "The target was always there," Joon-Hyuk said, his eyes returning to the obsidian cold. "The only difference is that now, I am the one standing in front of it." He led them out of the hall, the sound of their footsteps, one heavy, three light, echoing through the basalt corridors. The dragon had claimed his blood. The DNA had been verified. But in the world of the Kang Syndicate, a piece of paper was only as strong as the man willing to kill for it. And as Joon-Hyuk looked at the black van waiting in the courtyard, he knew the blood was about to flow. The dragon has claimed his heirs, and the syndicate is shaking. But did you see the way Jang Min-suk looked at Nia? The war is far from over. Do me a massive favor and let me know in the comments. Do you think Joon-Hyuk is being too protective? Or is he right to threaten the entire board? And tell me your city and country. We are strong and growing. If you're ready to see the African secret that saved the dragon's life, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The morning light that filtered into the grand dining hall of the Kang estate was as cold as a surgical blade, illuminating the deep, unresolved fissures in the family's foundation. Kang Dae-sung, the patriarch, sat at the head of the long table, his presence like a mountain of weathered granite. He watched in silence as Nia and Nora navigated the complexities of a formal Korean breakfast, their small fingers mastering the silver chopsticks with a focus that reminded him painfully of Joon-Hyuk at that age. Amara sat between them, a splash of vibrant color in her emerald dress, but her eyes were fixed on the doorway. She knew that in this house, the walls didn't just have ears. They had teeth. The heavy doors creaked open, and Do-hyun entered. He didn't look like a man who had spent the night watching his kidnapping plot crumble into ash. He was polished, wearing a light gray suit that made him look like a statesman rather than a syndicate enforcer. He bowed deeply to his father, then took his seat opposite Joon-Hyuk, offering a smile that was nothing more than a thin layer of ice over a dark lake. "Father," Do-hyun began, his voice smooth and measured, "I know we are all still adjusting to the sudden expansion of our household. It is a miracle, truly. But as the one responsible for our internal security, I have spent the last few hours doing my due diligence. I believe there is information you need to see before we integrate these newcomers any further into the Kang legacy." Joon-Hyuk's grip on his porcelain tea cup didn't falter, but the air around him seemed to solidify. "You were busy last night, brother. I assumed you were resting after your transport team failed to deliver their cargo." Do-hyun didn't take the bait. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a series of high-resolution photographs and a thick dossier, sliding them toward the patriarch. "While you were playing hero on the bridge, Joon-Hyuk, I was investigating the true nature of the woman sitting at our table. We all want to believe in a fairy tale, the savior from the hotel who raised the secret heirs. But the reality is much more calculated." Dae-sung picked up the photos. They showed Amara in London but not at the bakery. She was pictured outside a nondescript office building in Vauxhall, the headquarters of a private intelligence firm known for its ties to international corporate espionage. Another photo showed her speaking with a man in a dark coat near the Thames, a man Do-hyun had identified in the notes as a high-level handler for a rival shipping conglomerate. "Amara Cole is not a hotel maid who got lucky," Do-hyun said, his voice dropping into a register of feigned regret. "She is a honey trap, father. A professional asset trained to infiltrate high-value targets. 6 years ago, when Joon-Hyuk was poisoned, she didn't find him by accident. She was planted there by our rivals to ensure that if the poison failed, they would have a permanent hook into the Kang bloodline. The twins? They were the ultimate insurance policy. She didn't run to protect them. She ran to wait for the moment when the dragon would be most vulnerable to a takeover from within." The table went dead silent. Amara felt the blood drain from her face, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the photos, Images taken from angles she never noticed, during moments where she was simply trying to find legal help or navigate the bureaucracy of her migrant status. In Do-hyun's narrative, her struggle for survival was being twisted into a masterpiece of subversion. "That's a lie?" Amara whispered, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "I don't even know who those people are. I was looking for a lawyer to help with my residency papers. I was trying to stay alive." "A likely story for a trained actress," Do-hyun countered, leaning forward. "Father, look at the bank statements in the back of the folder. Small, regular deposits into a hidden account in her name, originating from a shell company in the Cayman Islands. This wasn't bakery money. This was a retainer. She didn't save Joon-Hyuk's life out of mercy. She saved it because a dead chairman is worth less to her handlers than a compromised one." Joon-Hyuk stood up then, his chair screeching against the marble floor. He didn't look at the dossier. He looked at Do-hyun, his eyes burning with a lethal, obsidian light. "You're getting desperate, brother. You tried to kill them, and when that failed, you tried to poison the mind of our father. You think these fabricated scraps of paper change what happened in room 309? You think I don't know the difference between a spy and the woman who held my head while I vomited blood? You're compromised, Joon-Hyuk," Do-hyun shouted, standing to meet him. "You're blinded by the scent of jasmine and the sight of your own reflection in those children. You're ready to hand the keys to the kingdom to a woman who was sent here to dismantle it. Father, look at her. She's an outsider, a ghost from a past we should have burned. If you allow her to stay, you are inviting the enemy into our bedroom." The patriarch, Dae-sung, finally looked up from the dossier. He looked at Amara, his gaze cold and analytical, weighing the evidence against the woman sitting before him. He was a man who had survived a dozen betrayals, many from people he had loved. To him, loyalty was a myth. There was only utility. "Amara," the patriarch said, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates, "my son makes a compelling case. The Kang Syndicate does not survive on faith. It survives on the elimination of variables. How do you explain these meetings? How do you explain the money?" Amara felt the weight of the entire syndicate pressing down on her. She looked at Joon-Hyuk, seeing the tension in his shoulders, the way he was ready to go to war for her even if it meant defying his father. She realized then that if she didn't speak now, if she didn't fight back with her own truth, the snake in the grass would win. "I can't explain the shell companies," Amara said, her voice growing stronger as she looked the patriarch in the eye, "because I didn't create them. But I can tell you about the meetings. The man by the river? His name is Samuel. He's a refugee advocate who helped me find a doctor when Nora had the croup and I couldn't afford a clinic. The office in Vauxhall? That was a pro bono legal clinic where I spent 4 hours waiting in line just to ask if a Korean birth certificate could be forged." She turned to Do-hyun, her eyes blazing. "You call me a spy? A spy would have taken the money you offered to disappear 6 years ago. A spy wouldn't have spent 5 nights a week scrubbing floors in a London subway station just to buy shoes for her daughters. You have all these photos, Do-hyun. But where are the photos of me crying in the dark because I didn't know if I'd have enough milk for the morning? Where are the photos of me teaching them to speak Korean so they would never forget the father they hadn't met?" She reached into the small bag she kept by her side and pulled out a tattered, flour-stained notebook. She slid it toward the patriarch. "That's my dossier. It's a list of every penny I've earned and every debt I owe. It's a list of the herbal remedies my father taught me, the ones I used to keep Joon-Hyuk's heart beating when his own brother tried to stop it. If I were a spy, I would be much richer, and your son would be much deader." Dae-sung flipped through the notebook. He saw the frantic handwritten notes, the calculations of pence and pounds, the sketches of roots and leaves. It was the messy, desperate record of a woman fighting a war of attrition against poverty. It was a document that couldn't be faked by an intelligence agency because it lacked the cold precision of a lie. Joon-Hyuk stepped toward the table, his hand resting on the back of Amara's chair. "The honey trap narrative is a convenient fiction, father. It allows Do-hyun to cover his own failure to eliminate the witness of his crime. He didn't find this evidence. He manufactured it. He used the syndicate's assets to create a trail of breadcrumbs leading to the conclusion he wanted you to reach." Do-hyun's face was pale, his composure finally beginning to crack. I am protecting this family. Joon-Hyuk is too close to the flame to see that he's about to be burned. Enough, Dae-sung commanded. The word was not a shout, but it silenced the room instantly. He pushed the gray dossier aside and kept the flour-stained notebook in front of him. He looked at Do-hyun, his eyes narrowing. You have always been clever, my son, but you have always lacked the ability to understand the strength of a person who has nothing left to lose. You brought me a story of a spy because you couldn't believe a common woman could outmaneuver you for 6 years. He looked at Amara, a flicker of something that might have been respect crossing his ancient features. You have a spirit that does not belong in a kitchen, Amara Cole. Do-hyun's evidence is a house of cards, but it has served one purpose. It has shown me that you are indeed a variable. But you are a variable that belongs to Joon-Hyuk, and as long as he claims you, the syndicate will treat you as his shadow. He turned his gaze to Do-hyun, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Do not bring me fictions again, Do-hyun. If you spend as much time securing our borders as you do trying to undermine your brother's blood, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Leave us. Do-hyun stood, his body trembling with a suppressed, toxic rage. He bowed stiffly, his eyes casting a final, venomous look at Amara and the twins before he turned and strode out of the hall. The snake had been stepped on, but as Joon-Hyuk knew all too well, a wounded snake is the most dangerous kind. The patriarch turned back to his breakfast as if the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. The children will begin their formal tutoring tomorrow. They are Kangs. They must speak the language of power as well as they speak the language of the street. Joon-Hyuk sat back down, his hand briefly touching Amara's under the table. She was shaking, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving her weak, but she met his gaze with a defiant nod. They had survived the first attempt at their character, but the war for the estate was only intensifying. He won't stop, Joon-Hyuk, Amara whispered as the patriarch was led out of the room by his attendants. He'll find another way to hurt us. I know, Joon-Hyuk said, his voice a low, lethal promise. But he made a mistake today. He showed his hand to our father. He thinks he's the architect of our destruction, but he's just a man digging his own grave. We aren't in London anymore, Amara. In this house I am the judge and the jury, and I've already decided his sentence. Nia reached out then, taking a piece of fruit from the table and handing it to her mother. Don't be sad, Mommy. The bad man is gone. Joon-Hyuk looked at his daughter, seeing the absolute, unshakable faith in her eyes. She didn't know about the shell companies or the honey trap or the poison. She only knew that her father was the dragon and her mother was the phoenix. And as he looked at the three of them, the family he had spent 6 years unknowingly missing, Joon-Hyuk realized that the snake in the grass was right about one thing. He was compromised. He was compromised by a love that made the syndicate feel like a toy, and he was ready to burn every gray dossier in the world to keep it that way. The breakfast ended, but the silence that followed was the silence of a battlefield between waves of attack. The snake had retreated to the tall grass, but the dragon was now watching every blade. The atmosphere within the Kang estate had shifted from a simmering cold war to a frantic, suffocating panic. It began in the early hours of the morning, a sound that bypassed the high-tech security sensors and the stone-faced guards, the sound of a heavy, ebony cane clattering against a marble floor, followed by the wet, rhythmic gasping of a man whose lungs were betraying him. Kang Dae-sung, the man who had built an empire on the corpses of his rivals, was finally being brought to his knees by a foe he couldn't bribe or bullet. His own failing heart. Joon-Hyuk was the first to reach the patriarch's private quarters. His silk robe billowed behind him as he skidded into the room. He found his father slumped against the mahogany bedpost, his face a terrifying shade of ashen gray. His eyes rolled back in a desperate search for oxygen. The syndicate's top medical team, led by Dr. Park, was already there, the air thick with the smell of sterile alcohol and the high-pitched whine of a portable defibrillator. But the doctors were moving with a hesitant, fearful energy. They knew the patriarch's history. They knew that his heart had been weakened years ago by a trace amount of the same poison that had nearly claimed Joon-Hyuk, a lingering shadow that had never truly left his blood. His blood pressure is bottoming out, Dr. Park shouted, His brow beaded with sweat as he checked the monitors. The digitalis isn't working. His system is rejecting the synthetic stabilizers. It's a cytokine storm. His body is attacking itself. Do-hyun stood in the corner, his face a mask of calculated grief that didn't quite reach his eyes. He watched the monitors with the intensity of a vulture waiting for the exact moment the heart stopped beating. If the patriarch died now, before the twins were officially integrated into the legal documents of the syndicate, the throne would default to him. He didn't speak. He simply waited for the inevitable. Amara stood in the doorway, Nia and Nora clutching her silk pajamas. She watched the scene not with the detached fear of the staff, but with the sharp, focused memory of a girl who had grown up in the shadow of the Kilimanjaro foothills, watching her father heal men who had been bitten by mambas or cursed by the slow-acting toxins of the bush. She saw the way Daesung's hands were curling, the clawing of the nerves. She saw the specific, yellowish tint in the corners of his eyes. "It's not just a heart attack," Amara whispered, stepping into the room. The guards tried to block her, but Joon-Hyuk cleared them with a single, savage glare. "Amara, stay back," Joon-Hyuk warned, his voice thick with the terror of losing the only father he had ever known. "The doctors are doing everything. The doctors are treating a symptom," Amara cried, pushing past the medical carts. She knelt beside the patriarch, her hands moving over his chest with a familiarity that made Dr. Park stumble back. "He's been exposed to something. Recently. A catalyst. The synthetic medicine is reacting with a trace toxin in his system. You're feeding the fire." She looked at Joon-Hyuk, her eyes blazing with a fierce, ancient authority. "I need my bag, the one from the library, and I need a mortar and pestle. Now. This is madness." Do-hyun stepped forward, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp anxiety. "She's a hotel maid, not a cardiologist. Joon-Hyuk, if you let her touch him and he dies, his blood is on your hands. Guards, remove her. Touch her and you die where you stand," Joon-Hyuk growled, his hand moving to the small of his back where he always kept a concealed blade. He looked at Amara, seeing the same girl from room 309, the one who had pulled him back from the edge of the abyss. He didn't trust the machines. He didn't trust the doctors who were on Do-hyun's payroll. He trusted the woman who had nothing to gain but his heart. Get her what she needs. Minutes later, the room was filled with a scent that was entirely alien to the sterile luxury of the Kang estate. It was the smell of damp earth, of crushed roots, and a sharp citrusy bite that seemed to clear the very air. Amara worked with a rhythmic, trance-like speed. She ground a combination of dried hibiscus sabdarifa and a rare, powdered root known as the lion's heart into a paste. Mixing it with a small amount of distilled water, she had blessed with a quiet, whispered prayer in her native tongue. "This will open the vessels," she murmured, more to herself than the room. "It will neutralize the acidity of the synthetic drugs and allow the blood to find its own rhythm again." She approached the patriarch, who was now barely conscious, his breath a rattling, hollow sound. She pried his jaw open with a gentle but firm grip and began to administer the dark, earthy liquid. "Don't let her do this," Do-hyun screamed, reaching for her. Joon-Hyuk intercepted him, his hand catching his brother's throat and pinning him against the wall with a force that cracked the plaster. "Watch," Joon-Hyuk hissed, "and pray she succeeds, because if he dies, I'm sending you to the afterlife to explain why you're so afraid of a cure." For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the room was the steady beep-beep-beep of the heart monitor. It was slow, too slow. The line on the screen was almost flat. Dr. Park looked at his watch, ready to call the time. Amara didn't move. She kept her hand on Daesung's forehead, her eyes closed, her lips moving in a silent command to the ancestors. Then the monitor chirped, a sharp, rhythmic spike. Then another. The ashen gray in the patriarch's face began to recede, replaced by a faint, ghostly flush of pink. His breathing slowed, the rattle disappearing, replaced by a deep, restorative sigh. His eyes opened, not rolled back, but focused. He looked at Amara, then at the mortar and pestle, then at his sons. The tea, Daesung rasped, his voice a mere shadow of its former power, but the authority was back. It tastes of home. Not this home. A home I've never seen. Dr. Park rushed forward, checking the vitals. It's a miracle. The arrhythmia is gone. His vascular resistance has dropped by 40%. I've never seen anything like it. Amara sat back on her heels, her strength finally deserting her. She looked at Joon-Hyuk, her face wet with tears. He's stable, but he needs to rest. No more chemicals for 48 hours. Only the root. Joon-Hyuk released his brother, who collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Joon-Hyuk didn't even look at him. He went to Amara, pulling her into his arms right there in front of the doctors, the guards, and his father. He didn't care about the optics anymore. He didn't care about the syndicate's protocols. He cared about the woman who had saved his bloodline twice. Dae-sung watched them. He looked at the twins, who had crept into the room and were now sitting at the foot of his bed, watching him with those identical obsidian eyes. He reached out a trembling hand, beckoning Amara toward him. She approached the bed, her head bowed. The patriarch reached out, his fingers brushing the silk of her sleeve. He looked at her not as a honey trap, not as a migrant worker, and not as a variable. He looked at her as a savior. You have brought more than just heirs to this house, Amara Cole. The patriarch whispered, his eyes shining with a newfound clarity. You have brought a wisdom that our money could never buy. Do-hyun called you an outsider. He was wrong. An outsider brings a knife. A daughter brings life. He looked at Joon-Hyuk, a silent command passing between them. The ceremony for the twins will proceed as planned. But there will be a third name added to the registry. Amara will be formally recognized as a member of the Kang family. She is the mother of the heirs, and she is the physician of the dragon. Do-hyun, still on the floor, looked up with a face twisted by a silent, poisonous hatred. He had lost, not to Joon-Hyuk's guns or his father's temper, but to a handful of roots and a woman's love. He had tried to frame her as a spy, but in doing so, he had only highlighted the very strength that made her indispensable. As the morning sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light into the room, the Kang estate felt different. The African legacy had taken root in the heart of the Korean underworld. The new kingdom wasn't just a political change. It was a biological one. Amara walked Nia and Nora back to their room, her steps lighter than they had been in years. She had earned her place, not through fear and not through deception, but through the very heritage she had been so afraid would be a burden. She looked at Joon-Hyuk, who was walking beside her, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. You did it, he said, his voice a low, reverent hum. You saved him. We saved him, she corrected, leaning her head against his shoulder. But the war isn't over, Joon-Hyuk. Do-hyun won't stop until one of us is in the ground. Let him try, Joon-Hyuk said, his eyes turning back to the cold, lethal obsidian that the city feared. He's fighting for a throne. I'm fighting for a family. And a dragon with a family doesn't just bite. He breathes fire. The estate settled into a quiet, restorative peace. But in the shadows of the garden, a lone figure watched the windows. Do-hyun wasn't finished. He had been humiliated, and in the world of the syndicate, humiliation was a debt that could only be paid in blood. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number that was scrubbed from every database in Asia. The route worked, Do-hyun whispered into the receiver. But the patriarch is weak. We move to phase 2. I don't care about the girls anymore. Kill the woman. If the phoenix dies, the dragon will burn himself alive. The morning after the patriarch's recovery, the Kang estate felt less like a fortress and more like a temple awaiting a sacred rite. The air was crisp, the scent of pine needles mixing with the lingering, earthy fragrance of Amara's healing brew. Within the great ancestral hall, a room rarely opened even for the syndicate's most vital business, the atmosphere was thick with a gravity that made the seasoned guards at the door hold their breath. This was the room where the names of the Kang line were carved into stone tablets, a physical record of a bloodline that had survived wars, famine, and betrayal. Joon-Hyuk stood near the altar, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning every shadow. He had doubled the security detail, placing his most trusted men in the rafters and behind the silk screens. He knew that his brother, Do-hyun, was a cornered animal, and a cornered animal didn't care about the sanctity of an ancestral hall. Amara stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She wore a traditional hanbok of deep violet, the high waist and flowing skirts giving her an air of quiet, regal authority. She was no longer the fugitive in the denim jacket. She was the woman who had pulled the patriarch back from the light, and the staff now bowed to her with a genuine, fearful respect. In front of them stood Nia and Nora. They had been dressed in traditional silk garments, their small figures vibrant against the dark basalt of the floor. They didn't fidget. They didn't whisper. They stood with their small hands folded, their eyes fixed on the man seated on the central throne. Their grandfather, Kang Dae-sung. The patriarch looked older than he had 24 hours ago, his skin still holding a trace of that ashen pallor, but his eyes were like twin lanterns. He leaned on his ebony cane, watching the children with a terrifying intensity. He was looking for a sign, not of DNA which had already been proven, but of the spirit. He was looking for the fire that defined a Kang. The history of this family is written in blood and iron. Dae-sung began, his voice raspy but projected with a force that filled the hall. We have never been a family of luck. We are a family of will. Many have tried to dilute our name. Many have tried to steal the fire. But the fire only burns for those who know how to hold the flame without flinching. He gestured for the twins to step closer. Nia led the way, her hand firmly gripping Nora's. As they approached the throne, the double doors at the far end of the hall swung open. Do-hyun walked in, his face a mask of cold, professional detachment. He took his place at the side of the room, but he didn't bow. He watched the children with a gaze that was so toxic it seemed to darken the air around him. "Grandfather," Do-hyun said, his voice a calculated interruption. "Before you proceed with a decree that cannot be undone, I ask you to consider the stability of the syndicate. To name these children now, while their mother's history remains a subject of internal debate, is to invite a challenge from the other clans. We are already seeing tremors in the shipping routes. The board is restless." Joon-Hyuk stepped forward, his hand moving toward the hilt of the blade concealed at his waist. But the patriarch raised a hand, silencing him. Dae-sung didn't look at Do-hyun. He kept his eyes on Nia. "Nia," the patriarch said softly, "your uncle says you are a risk. He says your presence makes our family weak. What do you say to the man who wants to keep you in the shadows?" The hall went silent. Amara felt her heart stop. This was the test. Nia looked at the patriarch, then slowly turned her head to look at Do-hyun. She didn't look afraid. She looked at him the same way her father looked at a rival, with a cold, analytical appraisal that made the older man's eyes flicker with a momentary, instinctive uncertainty. "The shadow is where the bad men hide," Nia said, her voice small but remarkably clear. "But my appa says the dragon owns the shadows. If the bad man is scared of the light, it is because he has a secret. I am not a secret. I am Nia." Nora stepped up beside her, her obsidian eyes narrowing as he looked at Do-hyun. "And I am Nora. We don't hide anymore." The patriarch let out a sound that was half laugh, half growl. A sound of pure, unadulterated pride. He looked at Joon-Hyuk, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The children weren't just heirs. They were weapons. They possessed the dragon's sight, the ability to see through the posturing of their enemies and strike at the core of the threat. "The children have spoken," Dae-sung announced, his voice booming through the rafters. "And their words have more truth in them than 1,000 board meetings. They do not flinch. They do not beg. They stand where they are placed, and they claim what is theirs." He stood up from his throne, the effort visible in the tightening of his jaw, but he refused Joon-Hyuk's assistance. He walked down the 3 steps and stood before the twins. From his pocket, he pulled 2 small, heavy medallions of pure gold, embossed with the coiled dragon of the Kang Syndicate. "By the authority of the patriarch, and by the blood that flows from the roots of this mountain," Dae-sung declared, "I officially recognize Nia and Nora as the legitimate children of Kang Joon-Hyuk. From this breath forward, they are Nia Kang and Nora Kang. They are the future of the syndicate. Their word is law. Their safety is the syndicate's primary directive. Let it be carved into the stone." A collective bow followed from the guards and the few high-ranking elders present. It was done. The decree was official. The twins were no longer the Black Twins or the secret heirs. They were the royals of the Seoul underworld. But the patriarch wasn't finished. He turned his gaze toward Do-hyun, and the warmth of his pride vanished, replaced by a frost that seemed to settle on the very stones of the hall. And now, we address the rot in our own garden, Daesung said, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. Do-hyun, you have spent the last week trying to dismantle what your brother built. You have used the syndicate's assets to kidnap children of your own blood. You have fabricated evidence against the woman who saved my life. You have valued your own greed over the survival of the Kang line. Do-hyun's face turned a shade of sickly white. Father, I was only trying to. You were trying to rule a graveyard. The patriarch roared, slamming his cane against the floor. The sound echoed like a thunderclap. You thought I was too old to see the snake in the grass. You thought Joon-Hyuk was too blinded by his heart to protect the throne. You were wrong on both counts. You are not a leader, Do-hyun. You are a parasite. He turned to the elders. By my decree, Kang Do-hyun is hereby stripped of his rank as executive director. His access to the syndicate's accounts is frozen. His security detail is reassigned. He is forbidden from entering any Kang property without the express permission of the chairman, Joon-Hyuk. A gasp went through the room. To be stripped of rank was a fate worse than death in the syndicate. It was a total erasure of identity. Do-hyun stood frozen, his world collapsing in the space of a heartbeat. He looked at Joon-Hyuk, seeing only the cold, pitiless victory in his brother's eyes. He looked at Amara, seeing the woman he had tried to destroy now standing as a pillar of the family he was being cast out of. You're making a mistake, Do-hyun hissed, his voice trembling with a toxic, uncontrolled rage. You're handing everything to a man who is ruled by a woman and 2 half-blood children. The other clans will tear us apart. The other clans will watch you fall first, Joon-Hyuk said, stepping forward. He didn't draw his blade. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make Do-hyun recoil. You are no longer my brother. You are a shadow without a body. If I see you near my children again, I won't wait for a decree. I will handle it personally. The patriarch gestured to the guards. Escort him from the grounds. He leaves with nothing but the clothes on his back. If he resists, treat him as an intruder. The guards, men who had once taken orders from Do-hyun, moved with a brutal, indifferent efficiency. They gripped his arms and forced him toward the door. Do-hyun didn't fight back, but as he was dragged past the twins, he leaned in, his voice a final, venomous whisper that only they could hear. The phoenix always burns out. Joon-Hyuk caught the movement and lunged, but the doors were already swinging shut. The snake had been cast out, but the venom remained in the room. The ceremony concluded with a feast that was both a celebration and a fortification. The patriarch sat with Nia on his lap, showing her the carvings on his ebony cane, while Nora sat beside Joon-Hyuk, watching her father's every move with an intensity that promised she would one day be an even more formidable dragon. Amara sat at the center of it all, the violet of her hanbok a symbol of her new status. She had survived the desert, the laundromat, and the van. She was a Kang. But as the night deepened and the guests departed, Amara found herself alone on the balcony overlooking the dark, sprawling hills of the estate. She looked at the gold medallion in her hand, the weight of it, the coldness of the metal. She had what she wanted. Her children were safe, protected by an army and a name that made the world tremble. But she knew the cost. She knew that by naming them Kang, the patriarch hadn't just given them a legacy. He had given them a target. Joon-Hyuk stepped out onto the balcony, his coat draped over his shoulders. He didn't speak. He simply stood beside her, his warmth a familiar comfort against the night air. He's gone, Joon-Hyuk said. My men followed him to a safe house in Incheon. He's being watched. He has no resources left. He has his hatred, Joon-Hyuk, Amara whispered, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon. And men like Do-hyun find a way to make hatred spendable. He told the children the phoenix burns out. He isn't finished with us. Let him come, Joon-Hyuk said, his hand finding hers. We aren't the same people we were in room 309. We aren't a secret anymore. We are a syndicate. And anyone who tries to burn the phoenix will find themselves facing the dragon's fire. They stood there for a long time, watching the lights of Seoul in the distance. The grandfather's decree had changed the world. But as the first light of dawn began to touch the peaks of the mountains, Amara realized that the real war was only beginning. The snake had been stripped of his skin, but he was still alive in the tall grass, waiting for the moment when the dragon's guard would drop. Inside the estate, a single phone rang in a room that should have been empty. In the basement, a guard who had been on Do-hyun's personal payroll for a decade looked at the screen. A single text message glowed in the dark. Phase 2. The school run. The velvet silence of the Kang estate was shattered not by a bang, but by a chilling, rhythmic pulse. The sound of the perimeter alarms being systematically deactivated from the inside. Joon-Hyuk was awake before the first glass pane shattered. It was a primal instinct, a relic of a decade spent sleeping with one eye on the door and a blade beneath his pillow. He didn't reach for the light. He reached for the tactical radio on his nightstand and the heavy-caliber handgun secured in the biometric safe. The air in the master suite had grown suddenly cold, vibrating with the muffled thud of suppressed gunfire from the courtyard below. Do-hyun wasn't just coming for the throne anymore. He was coming to burn the world that had rejected him. Amara, wake up, Joon-Hyuk whispered, his hand firm on her shoulder. She sat up instantly, the transition from sleep to survival seamless, a testament to the years she had spent as a fugitive. He's here. Get to the safe room. Do not stop for anything. The children, she gasped, her eyes wide with a mother's terror. I have them, Joon-Hyuk promised, his voice a low, vibrating tectonic plate. Go. Now. He watched her slip into the shadows of the service corridor. Then he moved toward the twins' wing with a lethal, ghost-like speed. The estate was a labyrinth of marble and silk, but tonight it was a kill zone. As he rounded the corner toward the nursery, the first of the intruders appeared, 3 men in tactical gear, their faces hidden by ballistic masks. They weren't syndicate men. They were mercenaries, the kind of scorch-earth specialists Do-hyun would have hired with his final hidden offshore accounts. Joon-Hyuk didn't hesitate. He fired 3 times, the sound muffled by the heavy drapes of the hallway. The first 2 men dropped before they could level their rifles. The third lunged with a combat knife, but Joon-Hyuk caught his wrist, twisted it until the bone audibly splintered, and used the man's own momentum to drive him into the stone wall. He didn't check for a pulse, he kept moving. Every second was a gamble with his children's lives. He burst into the twins' room, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm. He expected to find them screaming, hiding under the beds. Instead, the room was eerily quiet. The moonlight spilled across the floor, revealing a scene that made Joon-Hyuk's blood run cold and then burn with a strange, fierce pride. The heavy oak wardrobe had been pushed in front of the door. The floor was covered in marbles and small, sharp metal jacks, part of a game Joon-Hyuk had shown them only days prior, intended as a joke about home security. In the corner, crouched behind a reinforced toy chest, Nia held a heavy brass lamp like a mace, while Nora stood beside her, a small tactical flashlight in one hand and a sharpened letter opener in the other. They weren't crying. Their obsidian eyes were wide, scanning the room with a cold, predatory focus that was a terrifying mirror of Joon-Hyuk's own. They hadn't just hidden. They had prepared an ambush. Appa, Nora whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. The bad men came through the balcony. One fell on the marbles. Joon-Hyuk looked toward the glass doors. A mercenary lay groaning on the floor, his ankle twisted at an impossible angle, having slipped on the twins' improvised trap. Before the man could reach for his sidearm, Joon-Hyuk silenced him with a single, precise shot. Good work, Joon-Hyuk said, scooping both children into his arms. But we have to move. The house is compromised. He carried them through the secondary servants' stairs, fighting room to room. This was the siege of the hill. Do-hyun had managed to turn a handful of the household guards, men who had been bought with promises of a new regime. Joon-Hyuk found himself clearing the kitchen and the gallery, moving with a tactical fluidity that left the twins in awe. But as they reached the grand ballroom, the lights flickered and died, leaving them in a world of strobing muzzle flashes and shifting shadows. A flashbang grenade detonated near the entrance, white light blinding Joon-Hyuk for a split second. He felt a hand rip Nora from his grasp. "No!" Joon-Hyuk roared, firing blindly toward the sound of retreating footsteps. "Let him go!" A voice screamed from the darkness, "Do-hyun." The emergency red lights hummed to life, casting the ballroom in a bloody, surreal glow. Do-hyun stood near the grand staircase, his suit torn, his eyes wild with a frantic, twitching insanity. He held Nora by the collar, a pistol pressed against the girl's temple. Two mercenaries stood behind him, their red laser sights dancing across Joon-Hyuk's chest. "You took everything, Joon-Hyuk," Do-hyun shrieked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The rank, the money, the father's love. You think you can just build a family and forget the brother you stepped on?" Joon-Hyuk stood his ground. Nia clutched tightly to his leg. He could see Nora's face. The girl wasn't screaming. She was looking at his father, her eyes darting toward the flashlight still clutched in her small hand. She was waiting for a signal. She was a Kang, and she knew that in this world, survival was a matter of timing. "It's over, Do-hyun," Joon-Hyuk said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute, terrifying calm. "The estate is surrounded. My loyalists are in the courtyard. You're holding a child because you're too weak to face a man. This child is your heart." Do-hyun laughed, a jagged, broken sound. "And I'm going to break it." As Do-hyun's finger tightened on the trigger, Nora acted. He didn't try to pull away. He jammed the high-intensity tactical flashlight directly into Do-hyun's eye and clicked the strobe setting. The blinding, high-frequency light disoriented Do-hyun for a heartbeat. In that same second, Nia broke from Joon-Hyuk's side and slid across the polished floor, throwing a handful of the heavy metal jacks at the feet of the mercenaries. The distraction was all Joon-Hyuk needed. He fired twice. The first bullet took the mercenary on the left in the throat. The second shattered the hand Do-hyun was using to hold the gun. The pistol clattered to the floor, and Nora scrambled away, rolling toward the cover of a marble pillar. Joon-Hyuk was on his brother in an instant. He didn't use his gun. He used his hands. He rained down a flurry of blows that were fueled by 6 years of hidden betrayal and a father's primal rage. He drove Do-hyun into the ground, his fingers closing around his brother's throat. "You touched my daughter," Joon-Hyuk hissed, his face inches from Do-hyun's. "You threatened my blood. Kill me then." Do-hyun choked out, a bloody grin stretching across his face. "Become the monster they all think you are." Joon-Hyuk looked back. He saw Nia and Nora standing together by the pillar. They were watching him. They saw the dragon in his most terrible form. He realized then that if he killed his brother here, in front of them, he would be cementing the very graveyard Amara had tried to lead them away from. He would be teaching them that blood only answers to blood. With a growl of disgust, Joon-Hyuk slammed Do-hyun's head against the marble, knocking him unconscious. He stood up, his breathing ragged, his suit stained with his brother's failure. "Appa," Nia whispered, stepping into the red light. Joon-Hyuk knelt, pulling both children into a crushing embrace. He buried his face in their hair, the scent of jasmine from the soap they used bringing him back from the edge of the abyss. "It's okay. It's over. You were so brave. Both of you. We did the shadow game, Appa," Nora said, her voice finally trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. "Like you showed us." "You did it perfectly," Joon-Hyuk murmured. The heavy doors of the ballroom burst open, and the patriarch's elite guard flooded the room, followed by Amara. She ran to them, her sob of relief echoing through the hall as she folded the three of them into her arms. The siege of the hill was over, but as Joon-Hyuk looked at his unconscious brother being dragged away in chains, he knew the victory had come at a price. His children had seen the war. They had tasted the fire. The patriarch entered last, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked at the wreckage of the ballroom, then at his grandchildren. He saw the flashlight in Nora's hand and the metal jacks scattered on the floor. He saw the fire in their eyes, a fire that had been tested and found to be unbreakable. "The snake is in a cage," Dae-sung said, his voice a low rumble. But the dragon's nest has been disturbed. Tomorrow we rebuild. And tomorrow the world learns that the Kang family does not just survive a siege. We thrive in it. Joon-Hyuk stood up, holding Amara's hand with one of his and Nora's with the other. He looked at his family, the phoenix who had saved him, and the two young dragons who had saved themselves. The estate was a ruin, but the legacy was finally truly secure. The aftermath of the siege left the Kang estate smelling of ozone, expensive plaster dust, and the cold metallic tang of spent casings. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the shattered marble of the grand ballroom. For Joon-Hyuk, the physical damage to the house was irrelevant. The structural integrity of his soul was what had been tested. He stood in the center of the wreckage, watching his security teams zip-tie the remaining mercenaries. His father, the patriarch, stood a few paces away, his ebony cane planted firmly between his feet. They both looked at the same spot on the floor, the place where Do-hyun lay, bruised and broken, but still breathing. Joon-Hyuk knew that a cage was not enough for a man like his brother. A cage was just a waiting room for the next betrayal. He looked at Amara, who was shielding the twins' eyes as they were led toward the upper wing, and he knew that for them to ever truly sleep without a blade under their pillows, the snake had to be excised from the garden permanently. He signaled to his two most loyal lieutenants. Take him to the basement, not the safe room, the room where we handle the debts that can never be repaid. The walk to the lower levels of the estate was a descent into the dark heart of the syndicate. The walls here weren't covered in silk or art. They were reinforced concrete, cold and indifferent. Do-hyun was dragged between the two guards, his heels scraping against the floor, his laughter a wet, rattling sound that echoed in the narrow corridor. When they reached the soundproof chamber at the very end of the hall, Joon-Hyuk dismissed the guards. He wanted no witnesses for this. He wanted no syndicate protocols. This was a private reckoning between a man and the shadow that had tried to extinguish his light. You look tired, big brother, Do-hyun wheezed as he was slumped into a steel chair. The weight of the crown is already crushing you. Isn't it? You can't be a father and a dragon at the same time. One will always kill the other. Joon-Hyuk stood in the center of the room, the dim light overhead casting his face in a mask of absolute, pitiless obsidian. He didn't reach for a gun. He didn't reach for a knife. He simply pulled a small, glass vial from his pocket, the same design as the one that had held the poison in room 309. You've always talked about the purity of the bloodline, Do-hyun, Joon-Hyuk said, his voice a low, terrifying hum. You've spent years trying to prove that my children don't belong because they aren't pure. But you forgot the most basic rule of our family. The only thing that matters in this house is loyalty. And you are the most tainted thing I have ever seen. He stepped closer, his presence filling the room until the air felt too heavy to breathe. You told the children the phoenix burns out. You were wrong. The phoenix is reborn. It's the snake that stays in the dust. Joon-Hyuk didn't kill him with violence. He didn't give Do-hyun the satisfaction of a warrior's death. Instead, he made a single phone call in front of his brother, a call to the exile colonies in the high mountains of the north. It was a place where the sun never reached the valley floors, a place where men were forgotten by time and the law. He is no longer a Kang, Joon-Hyuk said into the phone, his eyes locked on his brother's widening pupils. He is a ghost. Strip him of his name, his history, and his tongue. He is to spend the rest of his days working the mines. If he tries to speak, remind him that the dragon is watching. As the guards returned to haul the screaming, pleading man away toward a fate worse than a bullet, Joon-Hyuk felt the last chord of his past snap. He walked out of the basement, leaving the darkness behind. He ascended the stairs, passing the cleanup crews and the forensic teams, and made his way toward the chairman's office, the seat of power that had belonged to his father for 40 years. He pushed the double doors open. The office was vast, smelling of sandalwood and old power. But the scene inside was unlike any that had ever occurred within these walls. The patriarch was gone, having officially retired to the safe house in Jeju, leaving the heavy obsidian desk empty. But it wasn't empty for long. Nia and Nora were already there. They had climbed into the oversized leather chairs that lined the wall, their small feet dangling, their gold medallions glinting in the morning light. They were drawing on the backs of syndicate ledgers with colored pencils Amara had found for them. When they saw Joon-Hyuk, they didn't see a mob boss. They didn't see a killer. They saw their father. "Appa, look," Nora said, holding up a drawing of a dragon with 2 small riders on its back. "We made a map of the house so the bad men can't find us again." Joon-Hyuk felt a lump in his throat that no poison could ever produce. He walked to the desk and sat down, not as a ruler, but as a guardian. He pulled the 2 chairs close to his side, one twin on the left, one on the right. He was the father on the throne, a concept the syndicate had never seen and would never fully understand. Amara stood in the doorway, her violet hanbok a stark, beautiful contrast to the dark wood of the office. She watched him. The man she had saved, the man who had burned his own brother's legacy to protect her. She saw the way his hand rested on Nia's shoulder, the way his eyes softened when he looked at Nora's drawing. For the first time since room 309, the fear in her chest had been replaced by a quiet, fierce hope. The dragon was finally home. But as Joon-Hyuk looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city of Seoul below, he saw the flickering lights of a dozen rival clans. He knew that the decree and the exile of his brother had only bought them a temporary peace. The syndicate elders were already whispering in the tea houses. They couldn't accept the mixed blood of the heirs. They saw the African medicine and the London upbringing as a stain on their tradition. The danger wasn't gone. It was simply changing shape, moving from the inside of the house to the shadows of the streets. The rivals were gathering. The blood was not pure enough for the old guard. And in the world of the Mafia, an unhappy elder was more dangerous than 1,000 mercenaries. Joon-Hyuk tightened his grip on the twins' chairs, his obsidian eyes reflecting the cold, rising sun. He was the chairman now. He was the father. And if the world couldn't accept his family, then he would simply have to burn the old world down and build a new one from the ashes. "We stay together," Joon-Hyuk whispered, as much to himself as to the children. Amara walked over and placed her hand on his, her touch a silent vow. The dragon, the phoenix, and the heirs were united. But as a black sedan with a rival clan's insignia pulled up to the gates below, a single message was delivered to the front desk. "The blood is tainted. The throne is forfeit. The war for the new kingdom was only beginning. The dragon has his throne, but the world is ready to tear it down. The elders are rising, and they won't stop until the mixed blood is erased." You saw that final message at the gate. The war is no longer in the shadows. It is at our front door. Family, we have reached the end of this chapter, but the dragon's journey is just beginning. I want to say a massive thank you to every single one of you for riding with us. We reached this milestone together, and now, it's time to take this story to the moon. Do me a massive favor and tell me in the comments, do you think Joon-Hyuk can truly change the syndicate's tradition? Or is he destined to lose everything in part 2? And if you are ready for the high-stakes war, the hidden African alliances, and the twins' true power, hit that subscribe button and join the family. Turn on those notifications for part 2, the Blood Rebellion. Don't forget to like and share. That is exactly what keeps this chronicle alive and strong. We stand stronger together. Now, the real hunt begins.